In this video, we're going to be talking about the truth of the healing journey that I've learned in my 20 years in spirituality and 7 years working with people, and I want to share these insights with you. Healing's kind of an interesting thing. It's a vague term that is not very well understood by society. You know, most people out there think that healing is the thing you do when you get sick and get back to normal life, or if you get injured and it takes time for your injury to heal, like a broken arm or a broken wrist in my case. And while that is certainly true, that's mostly the automatic healing process of the body. And like the body, sometimes it can't heal something properly, so it leaves behind scar tissue, or it heals in sort of a compromised state and localizes a solution, but it doesn't really regain a lasting and bring us back to the homeostasis that we once knew. And similarly, it's like when things actually happen to us on an emotional or mental level, you could even extend that out to a spiritual level as well. Something similar happens in those more subtle bodies. But of course, modern science hasn't quite got to the point where it's really ready to acknowledge these things that happen on a more subtle or energetic level yet. It's coming, and certain avant-garde scientists certainly have acknowledged these things. But the interesting thing is that what happens on these subtle levels is actually like the blueprint or the causal forces that actually cause things to happen in the physical. And there's sort of varying levels of density, the physical being the most dense. Then there's the emotional, which is like, we feel like it's more dense than thoughts because, you know, our emotions actually manifest as very strong physical sensations. And then there's the mental, which is like even more fine. And then there's levels beyond that, which is maybe the ancestral or the karmic, if you happen to ascribe to those lines of thinking. Which is important to note because these things often are directly responsible for how things play out in life, right? There's systems that I've discovered that can actually tell us, like, this is when difficulties will happen in life. And how that knowledge is preordained or known about beforehand, you know, is a mystery. But obviously it points to the nature that there's probably a greater design out there than our society is willing to acknowledge. Fortunately, the attitude in the mainstream is beginning to shift as they're realizing that the process of healing and of actually coming into a place of like integration and wholeness is a very multi-layered, interconnected subject for which there's a very complex interplay between thoughts, emotions, genetic conditioning, and the way that it takes its toll on the physical body. There's something called ancestral trauma that has basically entered more into the mainstream psychological profession as people are beginning to realize, hey, you know, the actions of our grandparents and what they went through might actually affect the way that our parents raised us and the way that we turned out. You know, there's obviously, we know that when raising children, that what you do in those first 5 years has a huge impact on the rest of their life. And if the way that parents are raising them is based upon a mountain of trauma from previous generations, or maybe even just unconscious patterning, we know that that's going to affect the child. So that's one very like obvious way that this plays out. But there's actually other ways in genetics that this plays out too. Like we inherit the genes of our ancestors. Now, genes just aren't just there to determine the way that we take, you know, certain things physically manifest, such as, you know, hormones and diseases and that type of things. Genes also do speak into the habits that we have in life, the attitudes that we carry, and our ability to perceive things, the skills we have, the beliefs that we carry with us. So these are all controlled by our genetics. And for the large part, we inherit our genetics. But of course, there's something called epigenetics, which allows us to shift and to rewrite them as we please if we know how to tap in. Of course, physical symptoms are usually the endpoint of materialization. So when something actually happens in the physical body, it's because there was a emotional pattern that was probably entrenched for a period of time that was caused by sort of a belief. And so when external stimuli comes in, that belief gets triggered, reinforces an emotional pattern. That emotional pattern becomes entrenched and basically results in some sort of a physical ailment occurring. In Ayurveda, for instance, they believe that disease isn't even detectable until about the fourth stage, and that it starts off with this very subtle, slight imbalance caused at a level that we cannot yet measure with our modern scientific instruments. But, what caused the imbalance in the first place is obviously a question to ask, especially if it is so subtle. For me, this is a bigger question. Everybody's going to have different ideas about this. But for me, I've always been amazed at how accurately certain systems can map out imbalances at the time of birth. And they can basically show us when or what the undesirable outcomes of our life and the desirable ones might be. There's something called medical astrology, and before allopathic medicine, in the Middle Ages, that was what doctors used to practice, was medical astrology. They look at the stars and they basically be able to correlate them with different things in people's bodies, and they'd be able to ascribe different treatments. It's one of my deeply held beliefs that, our genes are deeply connected to what happens up there. There's the ancient Hermetic principle, as above, so below. It's like what happens within us is a fractal of what's happening out there. And so when we learn that those have an influence, they have a correlation on our genetics, it's easier to see how astrology might actually work out. And it's not just woo-woo stuff. Maybe in a couple hundred years, the tenured scientists will come around to this and go, oh, actually. That's when humanity will really evolve. When we start to actually, on a mainstream scale, embrace a lot of the stuff that our ancient ancestors knew about and some of the great wisdom cultures knew about, that's really when things are going to get cool, especially when we have technology that's used positively to support that. That's going to be really cool. And I think already people are sort of getting downloads and impressions about that type of future. So basically, when we take a broader approach that incorporates the interplay of soul lessons and genetic conditioning, we can start to really peel back the layers and see how we might be able to heal on a deeper level, and understand too that some of the mysterious things that show up in our life that we don't like might actually be caused by something that is, determinable. And I've basically, in my work with people and my work on myself, I've realized that there's basically 3 critical steps for making a real shift and actually creating lasting healing and not being on a healing loop for half your life. And what I have come to realize that instead of trying to address the symptoms all the time, you got to go to the core of what's there. And so the first step of that is to be able to identify that core imprint or pattern that kind of sits, and all the other ones are sort of like layers upon that. Because if you try to go from the outside of the onion to the middle, call it, the healing onion, you're just going to be like, oh, one day I was here, and the next day I was 180 degrees, and then 90 degrees, and the mind's going to get very confused. But if you go to the core and you see the initial imprint, and then you see the complex interplay that had throughout the various pathways through life, you can see that it's kind of like when you take your Apple iPod headphones, if you're not using those awful ear pods, and you stick them in your pocket and you pull it out and the cable's all wrapped up. That's kind of like the complex interplay that I'm talking about, So the first step is to identify it. And it's cool because I've actually created an app that does this based on your birthday. It identifies your core wound, of course, because it's written on the fabric of reality out there. And so when you understand that and you're able to kind of contemplate that, and then, you get not very specific, precise personal information, you get sort of more of a contemplation of a theme. But hundreds of people that I've worked with have used this to tune in and to actually find their own personal meaning based on what this app provides. So it's called the Trifecta application. It's an entire system I've created, but the core wounding aspect of it really allows you to identify that central theme. So that's the first step, is identification. The second step is acknowledgement and allowance. We have a huge issue with labeling things as good or bad and judging them. And when we judge things, we condemn them, we create separation. So really what we need to do is actually acknowledge that this thing is okay. It might be out of balance, but it's trying to find harmony in its own way. And we just give it space. So instead of saying, oh, my selfishness is bad, It's like saying, okay, what does my selfishness really want? What does that quality within me really desire? Because obviously it's not working for it and it's not working for me. So what's this thing really after? I'm going to give it space. I'm going to just allow it to be. And what you'll find is that the selfishness isn't bad. We don't need to stop. We don't need to cut it off. It's actually a shadowy part of our genetics. And so that same gene has different bandwidths that exist as. And in the highest bandwidth, it's actually selflessness. And so that gene that was once selfish can turn into selflessness and create a very strong altruistic imprint or influence in the world. As a result of that, we don't get rid of it. We just give it space to allow it to grow and allow it to evolve, much like we give children the space to play and explore their world. And then finally, we invite it to shift. So we do sort of guide it on that trajectory. And that's how the trifecta system works, is it allows us to identify precisely for us what our core wounding is. Then that stimulates the left brain. Then we give it space, which is like, we're not clutching it emotionally. Space gauges the right brain. And then we invite it to shift, where the brain, two sides of the brain come into harmony, activating the central brainstem, or column, sorry, not stem, and then activating the pineal gland, connecting with heart coherence, which actually sends out a pretty strong signal, because the heart sends out an electromagnetic signal, shifting our attitude, and DNA is very, very sensitive to frequency, so it actually creates a genetic shift. And so the more that we walk through life with this affirming attitude, because we know the direction in which that core wound wants to go, we actually heal that relationship. So if you like, I've created an entire video that covers core wounding, walks you through the process. You can actually use the app. You can try it out for yourself. Super cool. And it gives you the entire process. It's right here on YouTube. So I'll just post a link to that video below, or maybe it'll pop up here for you. But anyway, I hope you found this helpful. This has certainly helped me get off the healing hamster wheel by just focusing on that one most important thing, so that I can get on with my life. I can enjoy my life without the burden of heavy emotions or sort of mysterious negativity weighing me down. So anyway, take care. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. See you later.